She wasn't supposed to fall in love. The contract said 30 days, no emotions, no attachments. But when the tech millionaire who treated her like a transaction suddenly grabbed her hand and whispered, "Stay with me forever," everything changed. What did he discover about the woman he thought he could control? And why did that single whisper shake his empire to its core? Before we dive into the full story, click like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. You're going to want to see how this thrilling story unveils. Let's go. The city glowed with the steel and glass confidence of winter in Manhattan. From his corner office, Frank Baston watched snow fall in streaks against the skyline. Below, the city pulsed with life. Inside, he stood in silence, arms crossed, jaw tight. On paper, he had everything. Baston Innovations had just announced a breakthrough product. His name graced magazine covers. His four closest friends, Macron, Gideon, James, and Brown, praised him often as the sharpest mind among them. But in the quiet, Frank knew the truth. They went home to wives, to warmth, to lives anchored by love. He returned each night to a penthouse where the lights greeted him but no one else did. That evening, he joined his friends for dinner at a private club. The talk quickly turned to the upcoming winter conference, a 3-month retreat on a secluded island where deals worth billions were struck over golf games, galas, and late-night debates. "We'll bring the wives, of course," James said with a smile. "They look forward to it more than we do." Macron raised a brow at Frank. "And you? Still attending alone?" The question landed like a blade. Frank smirked, hiding the sting. "It's business, not a honeymoon." Brown chuckled. "Perhaps. But perception is everything, my friend." Frank felt the weight of their words. He remembered Daniela at last summer's outing, her drunken stumble, the argument that nearly killed him. The shame, the pity in his friend's eyes. Never again, he told himself. Later, in his penthouse, the silence pressed harder. He found her, his maid, moving gracefully through the vast, cold rooms. She dusted shelves, folded linens, tidied spaces that rarely needed tidying. "Good evening, sir," she said softly, not pausing in her work. Her voice carried no pretense. Unlike Florence's purring charm, Clara's honeyed tones, or Daniela's fiery dramatics, her greeting was simple, steady. She asked for nothing. Frank watched her for a moment longer than usual. She didn't know it, but her presence anchored the house more than any expensive chandelier or imported rug. The next day, Frank met with his lawyer, Mr. Clinton. Papers were spread across the desk, but the conversation strayed from contracts. "You know you can't show up alone again," Clinton said, his tone matter-of-fact. "The board, the partners, even your friends, they'll read it as weakness." Frank scowled. "And what do you suggest? Hire another Florence? Another Clara? Another Daniela?" Clinton leaned back, studying him. Then, quietly, "Take your maid." Frank blinked. "My maid? She has character, a good head on her shoulders. Offer her a contract. She'll play the role for 3 months. You save face, she gains stability. No risk." Frank barked a laugh, though it was hollow. "It's absurd." "Perhaps," Clinton replied. "But sometimes absurdity is the only path forward." That night, Frank stood in the library, staring at the skyline. The snow fell heavier now, muffling the city's roar. From the corner of his eye, he saw his maid pass the doorway, her hands carrying folded sheets, her step quiet. He thought of Florence's laughter at charity balls, Clara's gentle deception, Daniela's drunken accusations, and then of her, steady and unassuming, a woman who asked for nothing. For the first time, a dangerous thought stirred in him. Maybe Clinton was right. Frank rarely asked for advice, least of all from his friends. But that night, as the 5 of them shared whiskey in Macron's study, Frank found himself uncharacteristically restless. The others spoke of investments, politics, wives. They lived in a world Frank stood outside of, despite his wealth. When the laughter lulled, Frank leaned toward Macron, his voice low. "I'm thinking of bringing someone to the conference. Not a partner. Not really. A contract arrangement." Macron frowned, setting down his glass. "A contract? You mean Paying someone to play your wife. Frank's jaw tightened. Not paying. Not exactly. More like giving her stability, security. She plays the part, nothing more. And this someone? Macron pressed. Frank hesitated, then forced it out. My maid. Macron blinked, then chuckled, thinking it was a joke. But Frank's face didn't move. The chuckle died. You're serious. She's decent. She won't use me like Florence. Or Clara. Or Daniela. Frank muttered. Macron's brows knitted, his tone gentler now. Frank, the world will talk. They'll call it desperation. They'll call her unworthy. I don't care what they say. Frank snapped, then softened, staring into his glass. I can't go alone again, Macron. I won't survive it. For a long moment, Macron said nothing. Then he sighed. If you do this, Frank, make sure you're ready for what it could mean. Contracts have a way of becoming hearts without permission. The warning lingered long after the glasses emptied. The Baston estate smelled faintly of cinnamon and pine, Susan Baston's way of softening the edges of winter. She greeted her son with a warm embrace, as she always did, though Frank stiffened in her arms. For Susan, Frank would always be her boy, the child who once tinkered with broken radios on the kitchen floor. For Frank, she was the last tether to a childhood before betrayal had hardened him. They sat in the parlor, fire crackling, porcelain teacups between them. Susan studied him with knowing eyes. You look troubled. Speak it. Frank leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Mother, the winter conference is weeks away. I can't go alone again. I've decided to take someone. Not a girlfriend, not a wife. He swallowed. A contract partner. Susan's smile faltered. A contract? Yes, 3 months. She'll play the part. Nothing more. Susan set her teacup down carefully, as though steadying herself. And who is this partner? Frank hesitated. My maid. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Susan's voice, sharp as glass. Your maid. Frank braced himself. She's loyal. She's steady. She won't betray me like Florence, or drain me like Clara, or, his voice cracked. She won't humiliate me like Daniela. Susan's face softened briefly at his pain, but her words were firm. Frank, you are a Baston. You are a man of standing. To take your maid to such an event, it will disgrace you. It will disgrace her. Frank's jaw clenched. What disgraced me, mother? Was Daniela drunk in front of my friends? What disgraced me was Florence whispering my bank balance in public. What disgraced me was Clara stealing from me while smiling at my table. His hands trembled. Don't talk to me about disgrace. I've lived it. Susan rose, anger in her stride. You let bitterness guide you. You would make this poor girl a puppet for your convenience? Drag her into a world that will eat her alive. She knows what it is. Frank shot back, standing too. She'll be compensated, cared for. It's business. Business. Susan's voice broke, more wounded than furious now. Marriage, even a false one, is not business. It is soul. And if you mock it, Frank, you may lose what little heart you have left. Frank's throat tightened. He turned away, staring at the fire as though it might consume the anger boiling in him. You don't understand, he muttered. I can't be alone again. Not this time. Susan's eyes filled, but her voice was steel. Then you are weaker than I thought. The words cut deeper than she intended. Frank's breath caught, his chest heaving. Without another word, he grabbed his coat and stormed out, the echo of her disappointment chasing him into the cold night. As he drove away, snow lashing against the windshield, Florence's laugh flickered in his memory. Gold-digging glamour. Clara's soft voice, false sweetness. Daniela's drunken scream, cold, unlovable. And beneath it all, Susan's words. Marriage is not business. Frank gripped the wheel tighter. For the first time, doubt gnawed at him. Was this a clever solution, or the biggest mistake of his life? The penthouse was silent that evening, except for the faint hum of the city below. Frank stood in the library, pacing before the fire. His mother's words still echoed in his ears. Marriage is not business, but he forced them down. He had made up his mind. At last he summoned her. The maid entered, hands folded neatly, her eyes curious but calm. "You called for me, sir?" Frank hesitated, suddenly unsure how absurd this would sound aloud. He cleared his throat, forcing the words. "I need you to come with me to the winter conference. As my partner." Her brow furrowed. "Your partner?" "Yes," Frank said quickly. "For appearances only. 3 months. You'll be compensated generously. We'll draw up a contract." Silence stretched between them. She blinked, her breath catching. "You want me to pretend to be your wife?" Frank's jaw tightened. "Not pretend to be my wife. Pretend to be my companion. Someone by my side. Nothing more." Her hands trembled against her apron. "Sir, I'm your maid. I clean your floors. How could I ever stand beside you in that world?" His chest clenched at her words. The doubt in her voice sounded too familiar, like his own, whispered late at night. "You have character," he said, softer now. "You don't scheme. You don't play games. That's more than I can say for anyone else I've known." She looked down, her cheeks warm, confusion swirling in her eyes. "And if I say no?" Frank stiffened. "Then I'll go alone." His voice cracked almost imperceptibly. "But I'd rather not." Her heart pounded. Part of her thrilled at the thought. An island, a world beyond these walls, a chance she never dreamed of. But another part feared the cruelty of high society, the whispers that would shred her dignity. At last, she whispered, "I'll think about it." Frank exhaled, his shoulders loosening slightly. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. The contract was signed a week later. Crisp papers on Mr. Clinton's desk. Black ink binding two people from different worlds. Frank's signature was sharp, decisive. Hers trembled slightly, as if the pen weighed more than her hand could bear. When it was done, she looked up at him. 3 months, she whispered, almost as if reminding herself. Frank nodded. 3 months. But deep down, neither of them truly believed it would stay so simple. Preparations began immediately. Frank insisted she accompany him to a high-end boutique on Fifth Avenue. She tried to protest, her face burning at the thought of walking into such a place, but Frank was immovable. Inside, under chandeliers and mirrored walls, she stood awkwardly as attendants draped gowns across her frame. "She's not a maid here," Frank told them firmly when they glanced skeptically at her plain clothes. "She's with me." The words made her cheeks flush. For the first time, she saw herself reflected not as a servant, but as a woman standing beside him. When she emerged in a simple navy gown, Frank caught his breath. She looked nothing like Florence's polished glamour or Daniela's fire. She was understated, steady, and yet, in that moment, she was radiant. "You'll do," he said gruffly, though his chest tightened in ways he didn't understand. 2 weeks later, they arrived on the island. The villa reserved for Frank and his partner overlooked an endless stretch of ocean, waves crashing against rocks below. Forced proximity began at once. Their rooms were connected by a shared living space, a reminder that appearances had to be maintained. At dinners with Macron, Gideon, James, and Brown, she sat at Frank's side, her posture stiff but dignified. Whispers followed. "That's Baston's partner? She's different." Frank's jaw clenched each time. But when she excused herself after one such dinner, cheeks burning from the scrutiny, he followed her. "Don't listen to them," he said, his voice low. She looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I don't belong here." Something inside Frank twisted. Memories flashed. Florence whispering numbers in his ear at charity galas. Clara smiling sweetly as she drained his accounts. Daniela laughing cruelly as she called him cold. And yet here stood a woman who asked for nothing but to survive the evening. "You belong where I say you belong," Frank said firmly. Then softer, "And right now that's beside me." Her breath caught. She nodded, not trusting her voice. She bristled, her defenses snapping up. "Honesty doesn't mean I want anything from you. I'm not. I don't belong in your world. For a long moment, Harrison said nothing. Then, in a voice low and deliberate, he replied, "Perhaps that's exactly why I noticed you." Her heart stuttered, but she forced herself to shake her head. "You shouldn't. I've already made the mistake of trusting the wrong man once. I won't do it again." His jaw tightened at the edge in her words. He recognized that tone. It was the sound of betrayal, a wound still raw. And though part of him wanted to press, another part recoiled. He wasn't sure he could offer the kind of trust she wanted. They left the cafe in silence, both carrying storms inside them. Mildred told herself to forget him, to bury herself in chores and routines. Harrison drowned himself in work, convincing himself it was safer to stay cold. And yet, both knew deep down, forgetting would not be so simple. What do you think, friends? Should Mildred protect her heart and keep her distance, or take the risk of opening up again? Comment below. I'm curious which path you choose. Estate that Saturday evening. Thunder rolling in waves that shook the old windows. Mildred had been sent to tidy the guest lounge, one of those rooms no one ever used, when Mrs. Kensington appeared in the doorway with her unmistakable smirk. "Change of plans," she announced. "Harrison is staying the night. The storm has grounded his flight." Mildred froze, clutching the dust cloth in her hand. "Here? Tonight?" "Yes," Mrs. Kensington replied smoothly. "And since my husband is away on business, I need someone I trust to ensure he's comfortable. You'll attend to him, personally." Mildred's throat went dry. "Ma'am, You'll do it." Mrs. Kensington cut her off. "Consider it an opportunity." Harrison wasn't pleased either. He had come for a short dinner, nothing more. Now, thanks to the storm, he was stranded in a house that buzzed with Mrs. Kensington's ambition. Worse, she kept making pointed comments about Mildred, pushing her forward like a piece on a chessboard. When Mildred entered the lounge carrying a tray of tea, Harrison's eyes flicked to her. She moved quietly, her hair slightly damp from the storm, her dress plain yet clinging to her frame in ways that caught his attention despite himself. "You don't have to serve me," he said, his tone sharper than he intended. "I'm capable of pouring my own tea." Mildred set the tray down, keeping her eyes low. "It's my job, sir." Her humility, so unlike the polished pretenses he was used to, tugged at him. "Is it your job?" he asked, voice softening. "Or is it what she tells you is your job?" Mildred blinked, startled by the question. For the first time, she lifted her gaze to meet his, and he saw it then, the flicker of quiet defiance beneath her innocence. The storm worsened, knocking out power across the estate. Mrs. Kensington made a fuss about needing rest, retreating to her wing of the mansion, leaving Harrison and Mildred in charge of candles and lanterns. For hours, they moved through the echoing halls together, lighting rooms, securing windows, their silence broken only by the crack of thunder. It wasn't comfortable silence, not yet, but it wasn't hostile either. At one point, Mildred stumbled while adjusting a shutter, and Harrison's hand shot out instinctively to steady her. His fingers closed around hers, warm, steady, firm. For a second, the world outside could have disappeared. Mildred's breath caught. Harrison's jaw clenched. Neither moved until she pulled back abruptly, cheeks flushed. "Thank you," she whispered, turning away. Harrison's chest tightened. He had touched countless hands in business, shaken deals worth billions, but this simple touch lingered far longer. Later, as the storm began to ease, they found themselves in the library, the only room fully lit by candles. Rows of leather-bound books towered around them, the air thick with the scent of old paper and rain. Mildred sat perched on the edge of a chair, trying to make herself small. Harrison leaned against the fireplace, studying her. "You don't like this," he said finally. She looked up, confused. "Like what?" "Being pushed toward me. Her games." Mildred's lips pressed together. It was dangerous to agree, but her honesty slipped out anyway. "No, I don't like it. I don't want to be used." For a moment, Harrison said nothing. Then, with a surprising gentleness, he replied, "Neither do I." Their eyes met in the candlelight, a fragile truce sparking between them. Both unwilling, both resisting, yet both bound by the storm and Mrs. Kensington's scheming. When Harrison retired to the guest suite hours later, Mildred returned to her small room, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't admit. She had promised herself never to fall again. But being near him, his steadiness, his quiet strength, was unraveling the walls she had built around her heart. And Harrison, staring out at the rain from his balcony, wondered why a maid's courage and honesty felt more captivating than all the wealth and power in the world. The storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet clarity in the air. The Kensington mansion gleamed once more, as if the chaos of the night before had never happened. But Mildred carried it with her, the memory of his hand catching hers, the weight of his eyes in the candlelight. She tried to lose herself in chores, scrubbing at invisible stains, dusting corners that needed no dusting. But her thoughts wandered back to Harrison Murphy, to the way he had seen her, really seen her, when he asked if she liked being pushed into someone else's games. Few people ever asked Mildred what she liked. A few days later, Mrs. Kensington summoned her again. "Harrison has invited us for dinner at his penthouse," she said with a gleam of triumph. "And you'll come with me. Wear something decent this time." Mildred's stomach sank. "Ma'am, I don't belong in." Mrs. Kensington waved a dismissive hand. "Don't argue. You're coming." Harrison's penthouse was nothing like the Kensington estate. Where Mrs. Kensington's home flaunted old money and opulence, Harrison's world was sleek, modern, stripped of unnecessary adornment. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan's skyline, a city that seemed to bend beneath his command. But it was strangely empty. Mildred noticed it as soon as she stepped inside. No photographs on the walls, no personal touches, just glass, steel, and silence. "You live here alone?" she asked softly when Harrison offered her a glass of water. His eyes flicked to hers. "Alone is simpler." There was something in his voice, a shadow, a quiet ache. Mildred wanted to ask more, but Mrs. Kensington's chatter filled the air, leaving no room for questions. Later that evening, when Mrs. Kensington took a call and drifted into another room, Mildred found herself standing near Harrison's study. Through the open door, she caught sight of a framed photograph half hidden on the desk. She approached carefully. "Frank, I'm sorry. If I embarrassed you." He cut her off, his tone cold, sharper than he intended. "You didn't embarrass me. You embarrassed yourself. Did you think you could stand in that room and be accepted? You'll never belong there." Her breath caught, as though struck. "Then why bring me? Why sign that contract at all?" His fists clenched. "Because I was desperate. Because I needed someone. And you—" His voice faltered, but he pushed on, crueler than he'd ever been. "You were convenient." The words shattered her. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Convenient." She turned, stumbling toward the door. "I thought—" Her voice broke. "I thought I mattered to you." The slam of the door echoed like thunder. Frank stood alone in the silence, Daniela's laughter and his maid's sobs colliding in his head. For the first time since the contract began, he realized the truth. He hadn't just hurt her. He had repeated the cycle, becoming the very betrayal he once swore to escape. And in the dark, for all his wealth and pride, Frank Baston had never felt poorer. The villa was quieter without her. Frank hadn't noticed how much space she filled until it was gone. The faint sound of her footsteps, the rustle of her turning pages in her notebook, even the hum of her voice in the kitchen. Now there was only silence, thick and suffocating. He found the note on the nightstand the morning after their argument. "Thank you for the opportunity. I will not burden you any further." His chest tightened as he read the words. Burden. That's what she thought she was. That's what his words had done to her. He crushed the note in his hand, but the guilt remained. The day dragged. At the conference meetings, his friends noticed the stiffness in his face, the way his eyes wandered to the empty seat beside him. Macron pulled him aside afterward. "She's gone, isn't she?" Macron asked quietly. Frank's jaw worked, but no words came. Macron sighed. I warned you, Frank. Contracts can turn into hearts. Did you drive her away? Frank didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said enough. That night, he sat in the library, whiskey glass in hand. The firelight flickered across his face, but his mind burned with memories. Florence's laughter filled his ears, elegant and cruel. She had once stood in this same position, her hand on his arm as she whispered, "With your name and my connections, we'll be unstoppable." He had believed her, until she drained him, left him, sneering that without money he was nothing. Clara's soft hands slid across his cheek, her voice tender as she begged for just a little more support. He had wanted to believe in her independence. Instead, he discovered her betrayal. Money funneled into another man's dream. Her tears had been convincing, but her lies had not. And Daniela, the storm, the dock, her drunken laugh turning venomous. "You're cold, Frank. A machine. No woman could ever love you." Her shove, his stumble, the near-death plunge. Macron's hands pulling him back to life. The memories swirled together until Frank slammed his glass down, his chest heaving. He had brought his maid into this world thinking she was safe from their poison. He had told himself she was different because she was simple, because she had no agenda. But in his fear, in his anger, he had repeated the cycle. He had become the very cruelty he despised. The following days were torture. At dinners, he sat alone. The wives asked where she was, their voices polite but curious. He brushed them off, but their knowing glances cut deeper than their words. At night, he wandered the villa restlessly. He found the seashell she had once picked up, still sitting on his desk. He remembered the way she had said, "It's broken, but it's still beautiful." He turned it over in his hand, and for the first time, he wondered if she had been speaking about herself, or maybe about him. He tried to work, burying himself in contracts and projections, but the numbers blurred on the page. His mind returned again and again to her quiet dignity at the dinners, the way she held herself against sneers, the softness in her eyes when she told him she wanted to learn his world. He remembered her laughter, unguarded, as they shared wine, the way she looked at him, not as a billionaire, not as a trophy, but as a man. And he realized something terrifying. He missed her, not because she played a role, not because she filled an empty seat at his side, but because without her, the villa, the conference, his entire life felt hollow. One night, unable to bear the silence, he walked the island paths. The ocean roared below, the same sea that had almost claimed him years ago. He stopped at the cliffside, staring into the darkness. Daniela's voice echoed, "You're unlovable." But another voice followed, softer, steadier. Hers. "Most things are broken, but they're still beautiful." For years, he had believed Daniela's words. But for the first time, he dared to wonder if the maids were closer to the truth. Still, fear gnawed at him. What if I let her in, and she leaves like Florence? What if she betrays me like Clara? What if she destroys me like Daniela? But then another thought cut sharper. What if she's the only one who never would, and I've already lost her? The internal separation was complete. Frank Baston, the man who had built empires from nothing, sat alone on the edge of his bed, head in his hands, whispering words he had never admitted aloud. "I love her." The confession tasted like both defeat and salvation. But the bed beside him was empty, and he had no idea if she would ever return to hear it. The morning sunlight poured through the guesthouse windows in pale, hesitant streaks, as if afraid to disturb the fragile quiet. Mildred sat at the small table near the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she had barely touched. She had not slept well. Every time she closed her eyes, the memory of Frank's face, his words, his broken voice from the night before came rushing back. "You weren't convenient. You were everything I didn't know I needed." And that terrified me. For days she had told herself she was a fool to care, that his world was not hers, that she had been nothing but a role in his elaborate performance. But those words, they had sounded different. They had sounded like truth, pulled from a place he had tried to bury. Her heart beat unevenly as she replayed them. Could she trust him? Could she trust herself? The tea had long gone cold by the time she whispered aloud, "He's trying." And though her voice cracked, a fragile hope stirred in her chest. Later that day, Frank stood outside the guesthouse door again, his hands clenched at his sides. He wore no tailored suit, no polished armor of the billionaire the world knew. Just a plain white shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, and a face etched with exhaustion. When she opened the door, surprise flickered across her features. She looked at him cautiously, as though afraid any sudden move might break the delicate truce forming between them. "May I?" he asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. She hesitated, then stepped aside. Inside, the air smelled faintly of herbs from the tea she had brewed. The space was modest: stone walls, simple wooden beams, a small sofa draped with a handmade blanket. It was nothing like the sterile perfection of his villa, and yet Frank felt something warm here, something painfully real. "I thought," he cleared his throat, searching for words, "I thought we might walk. No contracts, no parties, just us." Her eyes searched his, wary but curious. Finally, she nodded. The shoreline stretched endlessly before them, the sand cool beneath their bare feet, the ocean rolling in steady rhythm. They walked in silence at first, the only sound the distant cry of gulls and the crash of waves. Frank's chest tightened with every step. He had faced hostile investors, courtroom interrogations, boardroom battles. None of them had left him this nervous. But this wasn't business. This was his heart, and for the first time he was choosing to lay it bare. At last he spoke. "I need to tell you about them," he said, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Florence, Clara, Daniela." Mildred's breath caught. She had heard their names whispered in corridors, sensed the shadows that clung to him, but he had never spoken of them aloud. Now his voice carried both weight and weariness. "Florence," he began, his tone edged with bitterness. "She dazzled me, praised me, made me feel as though I was more than just a man obsessed with work. I thought she loved me, but she loved the idea of me, the rising star, the connections, the wealth she could touch. When my company stumbled, she vanished, left me with debt and shame." His hands clenched at his sides, but he pressed on. "Then Clara. She was soft, gentle, everything Florence wasn't. She listened, smiled, made me believe I had finally found peace. But behind her sweetness was hunger. She drained me, little by little, for her dream ventures. I believed her lies until I found the accounts and the man she was really building for. That betrayal," his voice cracked, "that one nearly broke me." Mildred's eyes glistened, but she let him continue. "And Daniela," he swallowed hard. "She was fire, wild, untamable. Against my better judgment, I let her in. For a while, she made me feel alive again. But her fire burned too hot. At last summer's outing, she drank too much, humiliated me in front of my friends, then screamed that I was cold, unlovable. Later that night, during an argument by the dock, she shoved me. I slipped. If Macron hadn't pulled me back, I might have drowned." The waves crashed louder, as though echoing the memory. Frank exhaled, his shoulders heavy. "Since then, every word, every look, I carried their ghosts. And when I hurt you, when I said those things, it wasn't you I was speaking to. It was them. It was my fear." He turned to her then, his eyes raw, pleading. But it was still unforgivable. For a long moment Mildred said nothing. The pain in his voice struck deep, unraveling the walls she had built to protect herself. At last, she stopped walking, her feet sinking into the damp sand. "Frank," she said softly, "I am not Florence. I am not Clara. I am not Daniela. I'm just me." He looked at her, as though seeing her fully for the first time. She drew a shaky breath. "I grew up in a world far from yours. My family had little. I worked 3 jobs by the time I was 16, washing dishes, cleaning houses, anything to keep food on the table. When others my age went to parties, I went to bed sore, with hands blistered from scrubbing floors. Her eyes filled, but she held his gaze. I never thought I'd belong anywhere outside that life, but I loved learning. I borrowed books, taught myself words I barely understood. I dreamed of more, not because I wanted riches, but because I wanted to matter. Her voice broke. And when you asked me to be your partner, even for a contract, it felt like a chance. Not to wear gowns or jewels, but to stand beside someone who mattered. To prove, even just for a little while, that I could belong. Her tears spilled over now, her chest rising with the weight of her confession. So when you said I was convenient, it wasn't just cruel. It shattered the only piece of dignity I thought I had left. Frank's throat tightened, his heart aching at her words. He reached for her hands, holding them gently, reverently. You don't just matter, he whispered. You are the only thing that matters now. By the time they returned to the villa, the sun was dipping low, painting the ocean in gold. The air between them felt lighter, as though they had left some of their ghosts on the shoreline. Inside, Frank crossed the room and picked up the seashell from his desk, the one she had found weeks ago. He turned it in his hand, then placed it gently into hers. You were right, he said quietly. It's broken, but it's still beautiful. Her lips trembled as she stared at the shell in her palm. Slowly, she looked up at him, her eyes shining. So are you. The words cracked something open inside him. For years he had believed Daniela's cruelty, Florence's indifference, Clara's betrayal. He had built walls of steel around his heart. But here, in her voice, was something stronger than fear. Hope. Frank stepped closer, his forehead resting against hers. Then maybe, broken people can be beautiful together. A tear slipped down her cheek, and for the first time since the contract began, she smiled. Not the polite smile she wore at galas, not the nervous smile of a maid out of place, but a smile full of quiet certainty. Yes, she whispered. Together. That night, the villa no longer felt cold. It wasn't love fully spoken yet, nor was it a promise secured. But it was something truer, a beginning. For the first time in years, Frank Baston let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, his heart wasn't beyond repair. The final weeks of the conference were the busiest. Deals worth billions were brokered, alliances formed, reputations sharpened. But beneath the polished surface of success, whispers still followed Frank and Mildred wherever they went. She's not one of us. He must be desperate. A maid pretending to be a wife. It's almost pitiful. Mildred felt each word like a thorn. She carried herself with grace, chin lifted, but inside, she feared the whispers would wear Frank down. She feared the moment would come when he'd regret ever standing beside her. That moment arrived one evening at a gala. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, crystal glasses chiming with laughter. Frank walked in with Mildred on his arm, his expression composed, his posture proud. Yet the tension was palpable. Eyes turned, whispers followed. A senator's wife, heavily jeweled, leaned toward her companions and sneered loudly enough for Mildred to hear. It's one thing to bring a woman of standing, but a maid? He mocks us all. Mildred's cheeks burned. She tried to steady her breath, but her hand trembled slightly in Frank's. She expected him to ignore it, as he had so many times before, to stay silent. Instead, he stopped. The music swelled around them, couples gliding across the floor, but Frank Baston turned to face the senator's wife directly. His voice carried across the hall. You're right, he said calmly, his gaze steady. She was a maid. She worked harder in a day than most of us have in a lifetime. And she has more dignity in her silence than you do in your jewels. The room fell silent. The senator's wife stiffened, her face flushing crimson. Whispers rippled, but now they carried a different tone. Shock, awe, curiosity. Frank tightened his grip on Mildred's hand and spoke louder, his voice cutting through the murmurs. This woman beside me is not a convenience. She is not a disguise. She is someone I choose to stand with. And if anyone here thinks less of me for that, then perhaps you never knew me at all. Gasps echoed. The orchestra faltered before resuming with nervous energy. Mildred's heart pounded, tears stinging her eyes. For weeks she had feared he would crumble under society's scorn. Instead, he had declared her worth to the very world that doubted her. He leaned close, his voice for her alone now. Let them whisper. I don't care. I only care about you. Her chest ached with emotion. For the first time, she believed he meant it. The rest of the evening blurred. Some guests avoided them. Others approached with cautious respect. Macron's wife gave Mildred a warm smile, squeezing her hand gently in silent support. But the most important moment came as they left the gala. Outside, beneath the winter stars, Mildred turned to Frank. Her voice trembled. Why did you do that? He looked at her, eyes steady, jaw set with conviction. Because you deserved to hear it, and they deserved to know it. Her tears spilled then, and for once she didn't hide them. He brushed one away with his thumb, his touch tender in a way that felt nothing like contracts, nothing like pretense. In that simple gesture, she realized something profound. Frank Baston was no longer fighting to protect his image. He was fighting for her. That night, as she lay in bed, she clutched the seashell he had returned to her days before. For the first time since their arrangement began, she didn't feel like a guest in a borrowed world. She felt chosen. And Frank, in his room across the villa, stared at the ceiling with a strange, unsettling calm in his chest. 4 years he had feared being seen as weak. But tonight, in defending her, he had felt stronger than ever. The night after the gala, the villa was quiet. Too quiet. Frank sat alone in the study, the fire crackling low. He had defended Mildred in front of the world, spoken words he had never thought himself capable of. And yet, inside, the storm still raged. Because defending her in public was one thing. Confessing the truth of his heart to her, that was another. He poured himself a drink, then set it aside untouched. The liquor had once dulled the edges of his memories, but tonight nothing could soften the ache pressing against his chest. Florence's laughter, Clara's soft betrayal, Daniela's venom, they whispered through his mind like ghosts. Cold, unlovable, weak, but louder than all of them was Mildred's voice, trembling as she had once said, I thought I mattered to you. At last, he couldn't sit still. He rose and crossed the hall to her room. His hand hovered over the door, his breath uneven. He knocked. The door opened slowly, revealing Mildred in a simple robe, her hair loose over her shoulders. Her eyes softened when she saw him, but caution lingered in her expression. Frank. He swallowed hard. May I come in? She stepped aside. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of a lamp. She sat on the edge of the bed, and he remained standing, too restless to sit. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Frank drew a sharp breath. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, his voice raw. I can build empires, negotiate with sharks, stare down men who want to see me ruined. But this, he pressed a hand to his chest. This terrifies me. Mildred's heart clenched, but she waited, letting him speak. I need you to know the truth. All my life I thought love was a transaction. Florence taught me that love was about status. Clara showed me it was about what I could give. Daniela, his voice faltered. She convinced me it was a game I was destined to lose. He paced the room, his hands trembling. So I built walls. I told myself I didn't need anyone, that money and power were enough. But then you came, and you didn't ask for anything, no favors, no riches, no part of me but my presence. And that scared me more than all of them combined. His voice cracked, breaking through the iron mask he had worn for years. Because you saw me, just me, and I didn't know how to let that in without breaking. Tears brimmed in Mildred's eyes. She rose slowly and stepped toward him. Frank! But he shook his head, his chest heaving. I was cruel to you because I was afraid. Afraid that if I let myself love you, you'd leave like Florence. Afraid you'd betray me like Clara. Afraid you'd destroy me like Daniela. And so I struck first. I told you that you were convenient, when the truth is, he stopped, his voice breaking. His eyes met hers, raw, vulnerable, pleading. The truth is, I love you. The words hung in the air, fragile and powerful all at once. Mildred's breath caught. For weeks she had longed to hear them. For weeks she had doubted she ever would. Now, as they fell from his lips, they carried all the weight of years of silence and scars. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she whispered, "You love me." Frank stepped closer, his hands trembling as he reached for hers. "More than I ever thought I could love anyone. And it terrifies me. But I'd rather be terrified with you than safe without you." Her sob escaped then, unrestrained. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. He held her tightly, as though afraid she might vanish if he let go. For a long moment, they stayed that way, two broken souls clinging to each other, bound not by contracts or appearances, but by the raw, terrifying truth of love. At last, she lifted her face, her voice soft but steady. "You could have told me sooner." Frank gave a broken laugh, brushing her tears away with his thumb. "I didn't know how." "Then we'll learn together," she whispered. He pressed his forehead against hers, his breath mingling with hers. Together. That night, as they lay side by side for the first time, not as employer and maid, not as partners in a contract, but as two people daring to trust, Frank felt something he hadn't in years. Peace. And Mildred, with her head resting on his chest, realized that the man she had once feared was unreachable had finally let her in. The final night of the winter conference was always the grandest. The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers, music swelled, and the elite of every industry gathered to celebrate deals sealed and futures secured. For Frank, it was supposed to be a night of victory. Instead, it felt like a crossroads. The contract between him and Mildred ended tonight. 3 months signed and sealed. By midnight, she would no longer be bound to stand at his side. The thought of it clawed at his chest. Mildred dressed quietly in the guest house, her hands trembling as she fastened the clasp of her gown. It was a simple dress compared to the jeweled gowns around her, but she wore it with quiet dignity. Tonight, she wasn't the maid pretending to belong. She was a woman walking into her last night beside him. She told herself she would smile, play her part, and walk away with her head high. But her heart betrayed her with every beat. She loved him. She had admitted it to herself long ago. But contracts ended, and fairy tales were not meant for women like her. The ballroom erupted in applause as Frank entered with Mildred on his arm. For once, he didn't notice the whispers or the stares. His mind was consumed by a single question. Will I lose her tonight? As the night unfolded, speeches were made, glasses raised, couples danced. Macron and his wife approached with warm smiles, but Frank could barely focus. Every tick of the clock felt like sand slipping through his fingers. At last, the music slowed, and couples began drifting to the dance floor. Frank turned to Mildred, his throat tight. "Dance with me." She hesitated, then nodded. He swallowed hard. "May I come in?" She stepped aside. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of a lamp. She sat on the edge of the bed, and he remained standing, too restless to sit. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Frank drew a sharp breath. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice raw. "I can build empires, negotiate with sharks, stare down men who want to see me ruined. But this," he pressed a hand to his chest, "this terrifies me." Mildred's heart clenched, but she waited, letting him speak. "I need you to know the truth. All my life I thought love was a transaction. Florence taught me that love was about status. Clara showed me it was about what I could give. Daniela," his voice faltered, "she convinced me it was a game I was destined to lose." He paced the room, his hands trembling. "So I built walls. I told myself I didn't need anyone, that money and power were enough. But then you came, and you didn't ask for anything, no favors, no riches, no part of me but my presence. And that scared me more than all of them combined." His voice cracked, breaking through the iron mask he had worn for years. "Because you saw me, just me, and I didn't know how to let that in without breaking." Tears brimmed in Mildred's eyes. She rose slowly and stepped toward him. "Frank!" But he shook his head, his chest heaving. I was cruel to you because I was afraid. Afraid that if I let myself love you, you'd leave like Florence. Afraid you'd betray me like Clara. Afraid you'd destroy me like Daniela. And so I struck first. I told you that you were convenient, when the truth is—" He stopped, his voice breaking. His eyes met hers, raw, vulnerable, pleading. "The truth is, I love you." The words hung in the air, fragile and powerful all at once. Mildred's breath caught. For weeks she had longed to hear them. For weeks she had doubted she ever would. Now, as they fell from his lips, they carried all the weight of years of silence and scars. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she whispered, "You love me." Frank stepped closer, his hands trembling as he reached for hers. "More than I ever thought I could love anyone. And it terrifies me. But I'd rather be terrified with you than safe without you." Her sob escaped then, unrestrained. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. He held her tightly, as though afraid she might vanish if he let go. For a long moment, they stayed that way, two broken souls clinging to each other, bound not by contracts or appearances, but by the raw, terrifying truth of love. At last, she lifted her face, her voice soft but steady. "You could have told me sooner." Frank gave a broken laugh, brushing her tears away with his thumb. "I didn't know how." "Then we'll learn together," she whispered. He pressed his forehead against hers, his breath mingling with hers. Together. That night, as they lay side by side for the first time. Not as employer and maid, not as partners in a contract, but as two people daring to trust. Frank felt something he hadn't in years. Peace. And Mildred, with her head resting on his chest, realized that the man she had once feared was unreachable had finally let her in. The final night of the winter conference was always the grandest. The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers, music swelled, and the elite of every industry gathered to celebrate deals sealed and futures secured. For Frank, it was supposed to be a night of victory. Instead, it felt like a crossroads. The contract between him and Mildred ended tonight. 3 months signed and sealed. By midnight, she would no longer be bound to stand at his side. The thought of it clawed at his chest. Mildred dressed quietly in the guest house, her hands trembling as she fastened the clasp of her gown. It was a simple dress compared to the jeweled gowns around her, but she wore it with quiet dignity. Tonight, she wasn't the maid pretending to belong. She was a woman walking into her last night beside him. She told herself she would smile, play her part, and walk away with her head high. But her heart betrayed her with every beat. She loved him. She had admitted it to herself long ago. But contracts ended, and fairy tales were not meant for women like her. The ballroom erupted in applause as Frank entered with Mildred on his arm. For once, he didn't notice the whispers or the stares. His mind was consumed by a single question. Will I lose her tonight? As the night unfolded, speeches were made, glasses raised, couples danced. Macron and his wife approached with warm smiles, but Frank could barely focus. Every tick of the clock felt like sand slipping through his fingers. At last, the music slowed, and couples began drifting to the dance floor. Frank turned to Mildred, his throat tight. "Dance with me." She hesitated, then nodded.